Hello, everyone, and welcome to Revolution Live. I am African Esquire, and I'm here with my two brothers who are both activists and very active inside of the liberation movement.
Hello, everyone, and welcome
Omowale,
to Revolution Live. I am
Oh,
African Esquire, and I'm here with my two brothers who are both activists and very active inside of the liberation movement.
You think it's open in two pages?
Sorry, guys, I have an echo. 1 second.
My two brothers who are both activists and
Okay. There we go. All right. So I'm here with my two brothers who are active inside of the Pan Afrikanist movement, and that is Omowale and Zach, also known as Son of Malcolm. So we're going to first introduce ourselves. So do you guys want to start?
Yeah,
Sure.
I can go ahead. Son of Malcolm, you can get started.
Sure. Yeah. My name's Zach Brooks. I'm a PhD candidate at Temple University in the Department of Africology, and I'm happy to finally be having some conversations in a public sphere about Pan Africanism and some other issues related to Black and African people.
Dope. Yeah, and as African Esquire said, I'm Omowale Africa. I'm an organizer located in the Philadelphia area. I work with an organization called Afrocentricity International. Our motto is simple. It's unity is our aim, victory is our destiny. So from like a Pan-Africanist perspective, we seek to organize and raise consciousness at the grassroots level so that we can essentially inspire people to act and behave in a manner that will change the conditions in our community globally.
So for everyone watching my channel, you probably noticed I've never done a live stream before, so this is my first time. And really all of this came together because Omowale reached out to me with this idea that him and Zach, Son of Malcolm, were talking about. And I really just want y'all to explain why y'all felt like we had to have this type of platform, why we had to have a conversation surrounding Pan-Africanism, and what really drove y'all to put this together.
Yeah, so essentially, Son of Malcolm reached out to me about a month and a half ago with the interest in creating a platform where we would have discussions that were really centered around Pan-Africanism, and we would, do analysis on real-time issues from a Pan-African perspective. But if you're online, like there's a plethora of like anti-Pan-African platforms that are out there. And I just feel like in our age demographic, specifically like among like millennials, there's not many people who have kind of like that Pan-Africanist perspective, or you don't really see it like on a lot of platforms being articulated in a way that's informative. So I just thought it would be dope if we could get 3 people who are actively, involved in organizing or in academia to kind of like bring our unique perspectives and have discussions that can be, informative, fun, and all that good stuff.
Yeah, I came up with the idea because, on a general basis, I'm told I need to be more active on a media platform, whether that's YouTube or some form of show like a podcast, where it's informative, because I am active within the university, and the university isn't a space that is reflective of the people who most need the information that would benefit from these kinds of informations. So the thing is, I've been encouraged to do that in the past. I've seen Omowale as constructive. He knew Miss African Esquire, so we had a couple conversations, and we decided to collaborate, and to have some conversations around some ideological things, some topical things, and just a general conversation around Pan-Africanism. And I hope it's constructive.
Absolutely. So we're going to get right into this, and I'm going to introduce the first, really the subject actually of the whole broadcast is that Pan-Africanism is not dead. Many of you might have seen on YouTube Yvette Carnell, who is very vocal as far as people who speak on behalf of Africans in America. And she made the statement that Pan Afrikanism is dead. And this really started a whole conversation regarding whether or not it was dead or whether or not we should even be trying to get it to come back alive. And I had put out a few videos about it. I know my friend Dwayne Omowale had put out videos about it, and a lot of people were talking about this. So we're going to give our perspectives on why Pan Afrikanism is not dead and why it's not dead for us. So the first question that we're going to talk about is, what is Pan Afrikanism? So I'll just start with my general definition of Pan Afrikanism. To me, Pan Afrikanism is really, it was a reaction to what happened when white supremacy started to dominate the world. What you've seen happening was that Africa was the one that got the most raided, lost all the resources. The people were the most enslaved whenever white colonialists decided to divide up the continent of Africa and essentially dominate the continent as if it was their own. So as a reaction to this, you have African people who are dispersed all over the world, and all of us are facing the same hell. As Marcus Garvey said, anywhere he went, he could go to Europe, he could go to the Caribbean, he could go to America, but everywhere he went, it was always African people who were the most oppressed. And so because of this, because of these situations, you had a reaction, and that was Pan-Africanism, saying, okay, we need to first understand that if Africa is not liberated, if Africa is not free, then us in America or else us in Europe or wherever we are, we really can't be free. We're all facing the same devil. We're all facing the same evil. And so the logical conclusion would be that we have to come together if we're going to actually liberate ourselves from this devil. And so that was what Pan-Africanism was. It was the idea that all of us throughout the diaspora, we could come together and actually find a way to liberate ourselves and find a way to liberate Africa, because without Africa being liberated, our people cannot be liberated. So that's my understanding of Pan-Africanism. I don't know what y'all think about mine.
No, I'm in a similar vein as you. Like, I mean, simply put, the way that I understand Pan-Africanism is essentially, you know, it's the joining together of African people across the diaspora and on the continent, but for the express purpose of overturning white hegemonic rule. Am I breaking up? Am I clear?
No, you're clear.
All right, yeah. So it's essentially the joining together of African or African descendant people, you know, throughout the diaspora and on the continent for the express purpose of overturning white hegemonic rule and ushering in essentially a new world order that's you know, based upon justice, where African people are, you know, self-determining. We are in control of our reality in terms of economics, our social reality, our spiritual reality, all the above. So I think kind of like that's where I start. But I think that as we go into the conversation, it'll be important for us to delineate between, I guess, like the types of Pan-Africanism, and more specifically, like the kind of like the Du Boisian, you know, aspect of Pan-Africanism versus more of like, you know, like a Marcus Garvey. You know, I think that for the viewers, whenever they hear the term Pan-Africanism, they take it as like this all-encompassing term that represents a pretty static or narrow ideology. But I think that there's a great deal of diversity within the Pan-Africanist movement. So this may be a good opportunity to highlight, you know, and share some of those differences tonight.
Now, before we go to Son of Malcolm, Anthony Micken said in the comment section that Pan-Africanism died with Marcus Garvey. Does anyone want to respond to that?
I mean, he seems. I mean, I think it would be wrong to say that he has a short memory. I think he just. I think the problem is he just hasn't found the histories that show that Pan-Africanism has persisted and proceeded beyond Marcus Garvey. You can't start or you can't end or begin Pan-Africanism with Marcus Garvey.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I was going to say it's impossible for Pan-Africanism to die in general, because Pan-Africanism will never die as long as there are African people. But the more pointed point is that Pan-Africanism is not something, it's not a Marcus Garvey creation. You know, it was here before Marcus Garvey. You know, the First Nations essentially that developed on the banks of the Nile, you know, as a means of joining together 42 different ethnic groups to resist outward attacks from the Hyksos. Like that same ethos that kind of led to the development of the first African nation is still alive today. You know what I mean? So as long as African people are alive, as long as African people are resisting, then Pan Africanism will always have a space and a place, you know, within our movement.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean the way I understand the way I understand Pan Africanism is at its simplest, it's Black unity. It's unity amongst Black people. But if I'm being more complex, I would like to say that it's a coordination between different groups of African people against the common enemy. And I'd like to explicitly say on African terms or on Black terms. So I agree with your definition where you said it was a reaction to white hegemonic rule, or I agree where you said it was a reaction to the invaders of Africa, and beyond just white people, you know. I mean, well, if we're extending white beyond just Europeans. But what I'm saying is Africans coordinate together in order to sustain their own interests. So to me, that's Pan-Africanism. So when we look at Haiti, when we look at Dutty Buckman from Jamaica coming over to initiate the Haitian Revolution, even though that may not nominally be called Pan-Africanism, that is an expression, that is the essence of Pan-Africanism. When we look at the coordination between the ANC or the PAC and ZANU, that is Pan-Africanism. Whether they called it that or not, I know some of them did. But I'm just saying, it's coordination between African people against the common enemy. And it's also on common terms, common cultural terms, or from my understanding, Black terms. Only African people are only Black. Everyone else who is not Black is not African. So they cannot be Pan-Africanist. So for me, Pan-Africanism is Black people uniting and organizing on the same terms against the common enemy and on the same interest to self-determine or to determine themselves. Omowale brought up the Hyksos. If we bring up even further back, Omowale, you brought this up before about Narmer or his Greek name, Menes. You know, the unification between Lower Egypt or Kemet and Upper Kemet. That is Pan-Africanism. So, yeah.
So it sounds like what I noticed is that I noticed this a lot with the Yvette Carnell issue. You have people making generalizations or people who might not have actually bothered to read African history or actually look for the information. And because they've been taught so many things from the American education system, we're constantly bombarded with this is where it stops and this is where it ended. I mean, I remember when I was in school, the Marcus Garvey chapter was the only mention of people talking about back to Africa. And that was really it. Even whenever it was discussed with Malcolm X, he was just the minister who was in the Nation of Islam. So we're so bombarded with the American education system and the American media that teaches us their narrative and what they want us to think is the truth, that whenever you have people saying, well, this is Pan-Africanism and this is that, well, these people automatically go back to what they learned and their limited understanding of what history is. So to me, to anyone who might come here who maybe you're a follower of a lot of Yvette Carnell's, a follower of her platform, and frankly, anyone's welcome to come. We're doing this in order to give you another narrative for you to consider. Rather than saying things, it would be beneficial to actually do research on these things, because Marcus Garvey, that was the beginning of the end of Pan-Africanism. You forgot about Nkrumah, you forgot about Lumumba, you forgot about a whole plethora of African leaders that came after. You forgot about Kwame Ture. You forgot about a whole lot of people. So that tells me that what you're saying is that you just don't know your history, and that's a serious issue. You should know your history enough, or you should be you should be inquisitive enough when people are making these statements to actually say, well, I'm going to actually go and do my own research, and I'm not going to just rely on what my notions of the world history are. So, you know, that's what I would just say to anyone. Be open to what we're saying. You can always fact check. I would love you to fact check, because that means that you're getting more information and you're opening your perspective up. And, you know, we're not saying we know everything, but for me, coming to be a Pan Africanist wasn't something I just did because it sounded good. It was the thing that made the most sense when I studied and studied and studied. So don't assume that we're coming out of here based off of emotion and illogical reason. You know, we have our reasons, and maybe you have your reason to feel how you feel, but certainly if you disagree, then do your own research and come to your own conclusion.
Yeah,
I agree.
Yeah, I think you know, when you raise the Yvette Carnell point and the lack of like historical continuity that we see just amongst Black people in general today, not just in America but everywhere, you see like this this lack of historical consciousness, and as a result, Black people are essentially, or African people are always essentially just reacting to present day phenomena, but we don't necessarily have the ability to contextualize that phenomena and understand how different systems kind of interact within our reality to produce the current set of circumstances that we see. You know, the things that we are faced with today, like these are things that have been thought out in great length. Like there's a great deal of planning went into ensuring that Black people occupy the position that we currently occupy globally. You know, this is not an act of divinity. You know, this is an act of man applying his mind, applying his knowledge to a problem. And from like the white perspective, that problem is Black life. You know, so for them, you know, the way that they solve that problem, essentially, you know, the end goal is either the removal or essentially the end of Black life on this planet. You know, I think that Garvey has let us know, like in his writings, people like Carter G. Woodson has let us know. And I think that now that we're seeing more and more economic anxiety being expressed by Black people, like we're starting to realize that, hold on, like there's some significant changes occurring in the environment, and I'm not necessarily prepared, and my progeny aren't prepared to survive given these changes. And as a result, I'm lashing out. I'm lashing out at people who appear to be taking rations from me. Like for instance, like with the Yvette Carnell situation, it's a significant anti-immigrant thrust that comes from that whole Black American descendant of slave movement that they have going on. But the reality is, like the immigrant population that's coming here from the continent, they're coming here, because it's the only way that they can have access to their resources, right? Because their resources have been colonized. So for us as Black people that live within empire, essentially, you know, we're making the same argument that like white feminists were making, like in the 19th century. You know, white feminists were essentially saying like, hey, incorporate us or integrate us within the power structures so that we can rule side by side. So as Black Americans, essentially what we're saying is, hey, you know, the American power structure is colonizing all these people all around the globe. We're not saying we want to stop that system. We're saying, hey, we deserve a bigger piece of these stolen goods. So we don't like the way that you guys are allocating the resources that you're stealing from Africa. It's not fair that there are Africans coming here and getting a bigger piece of the goods that you stole from them when we've been here this entire time and you refuse to give us more crumbs off the table that you're using to pillage the earth with. So I think that's that's one of the significant problems.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
Like I mean, for me, for anybody who follows me on Twitter, one of the things that I like to say the most is integration equals imperialism. So there's no way that you can decide to have the same terms or the same politics as people who consider themselves to be white and not consider yourself to be antagonistic towards African people, or not consider yourself to be an imperialist or align yourself with people who are the enemies of African people. So for me, when I see an integration of thought, even at an ideological level, any ideology that comes out of European thought in some form or fashion always connects to their imperial projects against African people.
I think that's actually a good segue into kind of like I guess the third question we had laid up today in terms of.
Let's get there. Let me get there, man.
So who can be included? You know, when we talk about Pan Afrikanism, who are we referring to? Who are we incorporating in this body of Pan Africanists? So let African Esquire start, and we'll go from there.
Nah, let me finish.
Go ahead, do your thing.
And actually, I want some of Malcolm to start because I know his perspective, and I think my perspective can play off of his. So.
Got it. All right.
Yeah. So, like, what I was saying is, like, where I was leading is, you know, like whiteness doesn't exist without white people, but whiteness is some of the ideas that come from white people, right? It's the extension of them into abstraction. It's the extension of them into other aspects beyond them. So what I was saying is, you know, like when we talk about certain ideas, like we can't just take antagonistic or anti-African ideas and throw black paint on them and then call them what we want them to be, or we can't remix them. See what I'm saying? So all I mean is, damn, bro, you had me. I was going where I was going. I forgot, but yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that because I can't remember.
All right, so the question is, and maybe African Esquire, you can help us with this. You know, like, who can be included in Pan Afrikanism?
Okay, cool.
Well, okay, Pan Afrikanism at its heart is African people, meaning Black people. It's a reaction to the fact that if you look at everyone who's been colonized, and really the whole world has been colonized in some way or another, except for Europe, we are facing the most severe circumstances of all of them. We have no control over resources. Our politicians are all bought by the West. These politicians are corrupt. And so we have these regimes that are really puppet regimes. We've been totally decimated by colonialism, unlike other cultures that were able to maintain some of themselves or maintain some of their resources. And we think about it, there's a reason for this. The reason is because Africa is the most minerally rich continent on the face of the earth. So it's no coincidence to me that African people, we have been the most depleted of everyone. Now, I know that Son of Malcolm, I don't know if you'll agree with this, but I do think that you can have, I don't know if you remember, if any of y'all seen Lord Jamar, who's always on Vlad TV, he did an interview where he was talking about white people in hip hop. And he says, white people they're not hip hop, but they're guests in hip hop. In the same way, I think that there are guests in Pan Afrikanism. And that's where I would put someone like a Gaddafi or a Nasser. There are people who, if it can benefit us to actually have alliances with them, then by all means, we should be willing to have some type of alliance. But to me, it's about what makes sense in the moment. So it made sense to align with Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. It made sense. And so to me, I'm not reactionary in the idea that I don't want nothing to do with anyone that's not African. I don't want any type of alliances. Realistically, if Africa is going to resist in the world, then Africa has to have relationships. And it does happen to be that on the continent of Africa, there are countries that are majority Arab because they have essentially pushed the Africans out of these countries. But if it is favorable to us in order to maintain ourselves as an independent people, to have some type of alliances with these people, then by all means, I'm not against it. It just is about what makes sense and what ultimately would benefit us as a people.
Well, you know, what you said actually makes a lot of sense. I mean, given that you said, like, okay, well, like, if we're going to advance our particular interests and coordinate with people who it makes sense to align with given a particular moment, that makes sense. I mean, if you look at the Haitian Revolution, like, they switched from being allies of the the British to being allies of the Spanish. You know what I mean? Like they switched according to their interest. But central to why they were able to do that is because they knew their interest. They knew their interest was to be free and to be self-determining and to be independent. You know what I mean?
Right.
A lot of the time, people who decide to align themselves with these people of color coalitions or these everybody coalitions or align with people who are not black or not other people, oftentimes what they do is they give people like Muammar Gaddafi, for example, they give him the label of King of Kings or the greatest African revolutionary, these kinds of things. And we know that's nonsense. My thing is like, even I don't care what your ideology is, even if you're a socialist, why are you giving the or communism by George Pattermore, and he says the greatest.
Zach, son of Malk, you breaking out really
American abolitionist.
That's why. Are you there?
That ever had or something like that. I can page that he said it, but all I know is I was like, why would you give it to John Brown and not to Nat Turner or to Gullah Jack? Excuse me?
You breaking up really bad. Like
Omowale, all right?
I'm here. African Esquire, can you hear me?
Everybody?
Yeah, you're just having some connection issues.
Hello?
Yeah, you're better now.
I'm breaking up?
Yeah, you were.
Can I?
Yeah.
Omowale, do you want to answer the question while?
Yeah.
Can both of you guys hear me?
Yeah, I would like to jump in. So in terms of the question, who can be included and Pan Afrikanism? So for me, I think.
Hold on, I'm trying to hear you.
African Esquire, can you hear me?
I hear you.
All right, cool. All right, so the question in terms of who can be included in Pan Afrikanism, I think that for the first thing we have to start with is we have to define, what African identity is, and if we're saying that African identity is first and foremost a racial identity, meaning people who are African descendant or black, to a certain extent, that I guess it almost like presupposes that people who are non-black, even if they are on the continent, cannot by definition be considered part of a movement towards Pan Afrikanism.
Can I tell you why?
Hold on, bro. I got a lot I want to unpack here. Right. So when we look at some of the Arab-headed nations and Northern Africa, I don't think that they ever lose sight of their identity. I think that they have the ability to adopt Pan-Africanism if it furthers their goal. For instance, like when you look to places like South Africa, like folks like Cecil Rhodes, right? So when people talk about Africa today, they say Africa is a continent made up of many countries. Well, the reality is Africa is a continent that's made up of many different colonial states, right? And a colonial state is a market entity. So the goal of folks like Cecil Rhodes was the consolidation of all of these market entities into one mass market for the Europeans to exploit for their own interests, right? So technically they could say, hey, I'm here on the continent and I'm also for Pan-Africanism, but I would never consider them Pan-Africanists, right? To give you a better example, if we look at the way socialism penetrated the Black liberation movement, like the socialists never really took on the aims of Black liberation. However, they saw the Black population, specifically in America, as a necessary van to achieve, the overthrow of Western capitalism. So as a result, socialism essentially penetrated Black liberation. I think you get the same thing with Pan Afrikanism, where you get people who are essentially Pan-Islamists, like in Northern Africa, who see, okay, by me adopting Pan Afrikanism, I can further my own mission. You know what I mean?
I think it's important to qualify something, though.
Go ahead.
I think it's important to qualify what exactly the interests of Pan Afrikanism are. You know what I mean?
And I think we stated that. I think that we stated that in the definition, right? For me, the goal of Pan Afrikanism, or the definition, is the unifying of African people, both on the diaspora and on the continent, for the purpose of overthrowing. Let's not just say white, for the purpose of overthrowing foreign hegemonic rule, right?
But even within the definition, but the reason I say I think we need to qualify it a bit further is because even like if we look at the idea of the United States of Africa, you see what I mean? Like if we look at that idea, everyone who had that idea didn't necessarily conceptualize Arabs as foreign to Africa. You see what I mean? Because Kwame Nkrumah saw Nasser in Egypt as an ally. He didn't fundamentally see him as an enemy. You know what I mean? Because Egypt was one of the first, quote unquote, from a European perspective, free African nation or whatever. I'm not saying Egypt's not in Africa. What I'm saying is Arab nation is not an African nation. But all I'm saying is that's like at that moment in time, like you were saying, Miss African Esquire, that according to your time period or according to your interests, you might want to coordinate with people who might be beneficial towards your interests. Did I get that right?
Yeah, if your interests match, because at the end of the day, there's going to be times where everyone's always self-interested. So that's the thing to keep in mind. Everyone's always trying to look out for themselves. Yeah. So it's always about when your interests match. You notice with the United States being allies with China, do you think that they're naturally just allies? No, it's because the United States recognizes that China is about to overthrow them economically. And so if we want to maintain our power in this world, we have to start acting friendly to these people, although we really have things in the back of our head that we really want to happen, and we really want to ensure that they do not gain a lot of our markets. But everything is about what is it that promotes your self-interest, and to have the attitude, and not saying anyone does on this chat, but I see it a lot, on the internet, where the attitude is that because I am against I'm so hurt by what's happened to our people. I'm so against what has happened to our people, from Arabs, from whites, from Chinese, that we have to get to a point where we don't mess with any of them. But our goal should not just be to be our own little sovereign, continent, but to understand that if we're going to compete as a continent, then you're going to have to forge some relationships. So the issue currently isn't that there's relationships with people to the African continent. The issue is that the African people receive absolutely no benefit from that relationship. The relationship is completely run by the Chinese interest, by the American interest, by the European Union interest. That's the issue to me. So it's more so if it does benefit us in a certain instance, then we can actually say, okay, we have personal interest in this, therefore we're going to have some type of trade deal or some type of alliance for this particular purpose.
Well, I agree with you. Go ahead, Omowale.
So I think that this is a point that requires a lot of teasing out, because you kind of almost have to go. You have to do a great deal of examination of history when you give this current analysis in terms of who is Pan Africanist and who we could potentially align with as allies, moving forward for what we're trying to achieve. If our goal is that of, let's say, global African sovereignty, being a sovereign people. Now, in terms of the formation of a nation, there's a few questions that go into that. Right, you have individuals who believe that the colonial states as they exist today, the goal of Pan Africanism is to form those states into one entity, right? And that entity will then operate in the interest of African people. So for me personally, I don't believe that that entity is capable of serving the interests of African people. So when I'm thinking about alliances or building relationships, the first relationship that I believe we have to build is the relationship with ourselves, right? So when I'm talking about, when I say Africa, my belief, and this kind of like goes on a tangent a little, but for me, Africa is wherever African people are. You know what I mean? Like the borders of Africa, Marcus Garvey talked about, creating an empire that would not, that the sun would never set on. I mean, that had a little bit of British imperialist ethos to it, but the reality is, given the way that, like the Arabic and the European slave trade have changed the dynamics and dispersed African people all over this globe, the first thing we need to do as African people, which I think what Pan Africanism is about, is come together as a people. And that becomes like the formation of a nation, because I don't think that we can utilize the current state apparatus as they exist to operate on our interests. I think that, we really have to go through a process of increasing Pan-African consciousness amongst African people globally for the purposes of African people building a state or a regional state, however you want to call it, preferably on the continent, that can serve as a vehicle to protect African people everywhere. Well, I don't think that we necessarily get that from aligning with any other world power, you know what I mean? But I think, again, it requires a great deal of evaluation and examination of history to kind of like reach that conclusion.
Well, I think it's important to go back to the question that was initially asked, where you say like, well, who constitutes an African? And I think that's an important question, because all nations are run by races or run by ethnicities. There's one dominant group that runs a nation, right? So if we're talking about Pan-Africanism and we're talking about a nation that reflects the interests of Pan-Africanism, we have to say, all right, well, who actually, if they ran a nation, who constitutes this? And I personally, based off contradictions that I see in history, I don't see Nasser as an African. I don't see Gaddafi as an African. I don't see.
They would see themselves either.
Excuse me?
They shouldn't see themselves as African either. I would be surprised if they did.
But you know what? The thing is, a lot of people are confused about that because maybe people would only consider Nasser to consider himself African, not Arab, if they never read anything Nasser said.
Yeah.
Gaddafi, on the other hand, called himself a Pan-Africanist.
He did.
And called himself an ally of African people. Right. And a lot of the time, people see this within a binary dynamic where they see the West versus everyone else in Africa. And it's not a binary.
But I think that's, for me, was where the original question, because I think I did get a little off of the original question, who's included into Pan-Africanism. That's where my mind was more so thinking, because with Gaddafi in particular, was he African? No. But did he have ideas that really could have been beneficial to Pan-Africanism as a movement? Absolutely. If Africa goes on the gold standard, that will completely decimate the American and European economy. So that's what I'm saying. If it makes sense in a certain instance, to me, that was an instance that it made sense to consider what was his plan as far as us considering changing the whole currency of the whole continent. So that was more so how I was
so I actually want to read an excerpt here, because it delves into like the earlier question that we asked about in terms of like the different schemes within Pan-Africanism. And I talked about like the Boysian type of Pan-Africanism versus Garveyism. But after I read this, I kind of like want to pose a question, and it's a subset to this first question of who can be included in Pan-Africanism. And the question is going to be, what role does race play in our idea of Pan Africanism, because when you look at people like, you know, Nnamdi Ezekwe, you know, he didn't believe in what he referred to as like racial chauvinism. You know, like for them, Africans outside of the continent, you know, weren't even included in Pan Africanism. It was about really continentalism joining the continent. And one of my biggest critiques of the colonial state as it currently exists, I just don't believe that it's an apparatus that is capable of serving the interests of African people. I believe that it's an apparatus that was built specifically to facilitate the exploitation of African resources. It was never built to serve the interests of African people. So in that regard, I think that it needs to be destroyed or removed, and something else needs to emerge or be built in its place. But before you answer that question, I just want to read this excerpt. This is from Du Bois' Dusk of Dawn, page 137 on revolution. He's talking about his concept of Pan Afrikanism. So he says, my plans as they developed had in them nothing spectacular nor revolutionary. If in the decades or century they resulted in such world organization of Black men as would oppose a united front to European aggression, that certainly would not have been beyond my dream. But on the other hand, in practical reality, I knew the power and guns of Europe and America, and what I wanted to do was, in the face of this power, to sit down hand in hand with colored groups and across the council table to learn of each other, our condition, our aspirations, our chances for concerted thought and action. Out of this, there might come not race war and opposition. I want to repeat. He says, out of this, there might come not race war and opposition, but broader cooperation with the white rulers of the world, and a chance for peaceful and accelerated development of Black folk. So that concept of like Du Boisian Pan Africanism, what it really is at the start of the 20th century, you have an elite group of Africans, and folks like Nkrumah are represented amongst this group. You have an elite group of Africans who are being educated in the Western world, but for the purposes to go back to the continent and serve as the leaders or the government of these colonial entities. So what they were agitating for was, hey, like, okay, you guys have colonized us. We accept colonization because we don't think it's practical to overturn it. However, I think that we should have a greater say in the politics and government of the colonies. That's essentially what the Du Boisian type of Pan-Africanism is, which, you know, is my critique in saying that Pan Africanism does not serve the interests of African people. I think essentially what it does is it upholds the current, you know, paradigm.
I think we have to be careful because while I think certain Pan-Africanists had Eurocentric ideas, I don't necessarily think that they saw themselves as, if I can use Toussaint Louverture as an example, where he wanted Haiti to be a French colony, not fully independent. You know what I mean? I don't think all Pan-Africanists had that idea of their relationship to Europe. Now, while they might have been Eurocentric, I don't think that's I don't think they've all understood themselves in relationship to Europe in that way. But I think
you have to look at it for what it is.
There's a bit of nuance there. That's why I said.
I think specifically in that time period, and you know, you can assess this based upon the actions. Like for instance, like, you know, with Nkrumah, he comes back and he's the prime minister of, you know, of the Gold Coast that would come to be Ghana. But you know, one of his first actions as, you know, leader of that country is to jump into bed economically with America. So my thing is, if you actually understood the underlying, you know, Garvey said, in a world of wolves, one should always go armed, right? And the practice of race first in all parts of the world is our greatest defense. So if we understood the race implication of Pan-Africanism, there's no way that you could essentially, you know, become the head of this colonial state, but then jump in bed with another colonial power and think that it would actually achieve some type of economic change for people.
With Nkrumah, I think he's guilty of what I think a lot of African leaders are guilty of. For example, I think the president of Ghana, I can't remember his name, he's guilty of this, and that is having high hopes as far as how you'll be able to interact with the colonial powers. So, for example, I don't think that Nkrumah was fully understanding of the nature of imperialism and colonialism and of the mindset of the United States, how the United States wanted to continue colonialism. Yeah. I think that once Ghana and other African nations were liberated, that the belief was that there was going to be some type of acceptance of African independence, not knowing that there were cooperative operations going on where you have the United States and Europe plotting on how can we regain power. So what I think is when I say alliances, and alliances is a bad word, so it shouldn't be alliance, but common interests. Is that first we have to
interest convergence. That's Derek Bell's word. But go ahead. Sorry.
Use that. We have to. My biggest issue with our people is that we don't study history that deeply, and we don't really look at what happened, why certain liberation movements were overrun. Why the Black Panthers were overrun, why did Pan Afrikanism fall apart. If we don't study what happened, then we're going to repeat the same notions and think, oh, we can be friends with the United States, and not understand that the United States is going to be of the impression that we want to regain dominance once Africa is free. So saying that, I think that our future leaders, once Africa is liberated, will have to take the stance that we're going to understand imperialism, understand that these people are waiting to get their hand back into our economy, back into our resources. And based off of what we know, we have to make intelligent decisions. But if it does meet our interests in specific circumstances, then we're also getting ahead of ourselves because Africa isn't free to make those decisions right now. But whenever that does happen, then it always to me is whatever makes sense in the specific circumstance, always understanding though that the West is really, our biggest enemy. So don't go too far.
I think
I think there's a can I say something? Mm-hmm. I think it's important to make an ideological point where we say, does our ideology, whatever it is, factor in the perpetual antagonism that is associated with whiteness or European imperialism? Because the thing is, it seems to me, from all of my studies in history, from all of my personal experiences, that whiteness seems to be perpetually antagonistic in whatever form that takes. Whether that's communism, whether that's capitalism, whether it's of particular religion, whatever it is, they always have to dictate the terms on which people that are outside of themselves coordinate. And when they dictate those terms, the terms always suit their interests better than someone else's because of a power dynamic.
Yeah.
I think that as we can see, like from like this juncture of the conversation, that when we're discussing Pan Afrikanism, like there's great diversity and thought, like when it comes to Pan Afrikanism, especially like when we start talking about the implications of race. When you factor in race, like for me, I'm someone who would definitely consider myself race first in my analysis, but I don't think that necessarily everyone has that. But the important thing is for us to continue to be able to have these conversations, right, like in-house, so that we can examine what have been the assumptions of the past. Now that the past has actually played out, what was the reality? And based upon this new information, how do we essentially adjust to move forward to achieve that goal of global Pan-African unity for the purpose of overthrowing this current world order?
Well,
with that, I want us to pivot because we're at 8:50 right now. So I want us to pivot into the question about why are there so many attacks on Pan Afrikanism? And I think that we can all speak to that, but whoever wants to kind of like jump in on that first, because there's a great deal of attacks right now, like on the idea of.
I can connect what I was saying to the attacks on Pan Afrikanism. My point is, when you share terms with people who have more power than you, or you share terms with your oppressor, a lot of the time they're moral terms, right? This is what's good for both of us, right? This is what's good. This is what sounds good, right? And they say this is what's good for everybody. And then when you share the terms, it only advances their interest, or it only allows them to continue to have a greater amount of power than you. So the reason I brought up the excuse me. The reason I brought up the ideological point is because if your ideology doesn't factor that in about white people, racists, then you're colorblind. Even if it's to a smaller degree than maybe let's say an apologist or a coon. You know what I mean? If your ideology doesn't factor in that antagonism, then the thing is it's going to be insufficient. So
from a real world perspective, given the consciousness of our people, just like make it very simple, very plain. Like, why do we feel
real world perspective?
So many attacks on Pan Afrikanism.
Real world perspective.
Yeah. Just make it plain.
Real world perspective. When you let white people into your organizations, they won't join your organizations if you understand that the problem is race first. They won't join your organizations if racism doesn't only mean you're mean to me. They won't join your organizations if racism means paternalism, because they have no space for leadership.
Let me ask the question in another way, to be a bit more pointed. Our sister African Esquire, am I clear? Am I loud enough here?
You look at the Panthers; they had white chapters.
Let me ask the question.
White people weren't being vindicated.
When we look at emerging personalities like that of Yvette Carnell, she represents a pretty significant movement or consciousness that is outwardly anti-Pan Africanism within the segment of Africans in America. Like, why do we feel there's such a growing movement that has this visceral hate and dislike for Pan Africanism? Like, let's try to speak to that.
I think Son of Malcolm touched on it earlier, and that is that what Pan Afrikanism represents. Pan Afrikanism represents basically an end of everything that we've been taught to believe in. We've been taught to believe that we live in the greatest country in the world, that we're so lucky to be in this country, that we need to be successful in this country, and that there's no other reality. And so when you have people giving you the notion that there's another reality that you could consider, what if Africa was free? What if the most minerally wealthy continent on the planet was free for African people to actually have a part in the resources? So you're giving a whole nother scenario. And I think what happens is that it's kind of like cognitive dissonance. Like, well, I've always been taught this. I've always been taught that this is the best place to live. And so what you have is a lot of people reacting against it the same way that it's kind of like when you're saying, consider Africa instead of this place, you're essentially telling someone to leave the plantation, and the plantation is all they've ever known. So you're attacking their entire reality. When you're saying, well, there's somewhere better to go, they're not willing to consider that because they've been educated to believe that this is the only place or this is the only reality that they can have. Not knowing, as was touched on earlier, if you don't consider Africa, everyone else is considering Africa, people. That's what you have to understand. Like, there was an article that I read on my channel, and it was talking about how Africa is going to be the future. And African people are going to be the predominant population in the world. Africa has the most resources. Everyone's flocking to Africa. So while you're running from Africa and running to your current reality, everyone else sees the value in what you're losing out on.
That's good. That's a good. Son of Milk, you want to jump in terms of why there's this super hate movement towards Pan Africanism?
I think there's a super hate movement because, I mean, we can look at it. We can look at it from two different ways. I think people have this religious orientation about what America is, and I don't think they can put history within its context. I think they can't look at history and say, all right, well, if we look at every empire ever, there was a ruling class of ruling elites that were a particular ethnicity or included particular ethnicities within who they would include within their empire. And then there were other people who they saw as enemies and people who were enslavable. America sees African people not as American, but as instead, if you look at white supremacy as a whole, as pan
Zach, I think your connection is breaking up.
European war over to Africa. Don't bring that war amongst Black people.
Son of Malk,
the difference is Europe doesn't have material resources that they're digging out the ground. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you were breaking up.
Can you hear me?
You were breaking up.
The connection is choppy.
Just in case everybody else lost. Is everybody okay?
We
could go to Omowale. You want to take it while?
Hello?
Yeah. I would love to.
Hello?
Jump in here. Son of Mark, hold on 1 second.
I won't exit out. I'm strong.
Yeah, he has the screen right now. I'm like,
I ain't gonna do it.
Yo, Mark, can you
hello?
Try to mute your joint or log off and log back on.
Yeah, try logging off and coming back in.
All right, cool. Can you hear me, sis?
Yeah.
All right, cool. So why is there a growing movement of hate towards Pan Afrikanism? I think at its core, it's due to rejection of African identity. In a sense, hate for Pan Afrikanism almost represents a type of self-hate. What it means for some people to embrace an identity that.
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
But yeah, so what I was essentially saying is, like, this movement that we see, where there's like so much hate for Pan Afrikanism, I think that it more so has to do with, at its core, it has to do with a rejection of African identity. Anti-Pan Afrikanism is, in a sense, it's almost a means of self-hate. African identity is something that has been so denigrated and something that's associated with such shame that people don't need much else to kind of like to throw it away and build an identity on something else, like Americanism or this new movement, Aboriginalism, you know what I mean? So when it comes down to it, there's this inherent belief that the white power structure as it currently exists will continue to exist. And in this current paradigm, America, as empire, represents an attractive power source, and we have proximity to it as Americans. But when we move towards Africans or African identity, we lose our closeness or our ability to benefit from that which is Americanist. So I think that's why you see this growing rejection, right? So I think there's two kind of like underlying components beyond just the self-hate aspect. There's the economic anxiety aspect. You know what I mean? Like globally, the world is undergoing an economic restructuring, right? We're moving more towards automation, artificial intelligence, and these things are going to require less and less human labor. So, like, for instance, when you see Barack Obama recently down in South Africa, and he's promulgating the benefits of progressive liberalism, he's talking about bringing in a universal basic income, right, to solve the problem of colonialism, meaning to solve the problem of inappropriate resource allocation, right? I don't know if I'm going on a super tangent here, but like, let me bring it back. The two underlying points that I really want to make, beyond this hate movement being fueled by a sense of anti-African identity, it's fueled by a sense of economic anxiety, and it's also fueled by a sense of lack of historical consciousness. Like when you don't know yourself and understand this movement or what we're fighting for, it's very easy to seek shelter and refuge in Americanism or other flights of fantasy that we adopt to deal with our current reality.
I know one thing I left out. I mean, do you want to go, Miss African Esquire? Or
no, I already went. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I guess I missed that. But one thing I think it is with anti-Africanism in general, or anti-Africanness. Nobody wants to be African because African is at the bottom of the barrel in terms of the social order of societies determined or shaped by white supremacy, by imperialism, by neocolonialism. Right. It always is. Mm-hmm. So the thing is, you're miseducated to never want to associate yourself with any form of Africanity or any form of African identity or any form of Africanness, right? You don't want any parts. And I think Pan Afrikanism, I think people need a base level of consciousness where they can at least admit, you know what? Black people are African people and Black people have similar issues. And without that, there's no such thing as Pan-African consciousness.
Yeah.
They won't look anywhere else and see Pan-African issues. They won't. And I think that's what they need. Because, I don't think people see the relationship between colonialism and segregation and racism. People don't see those relationships. People think that in Africa, they think Africans run their own country, and they think Africans are the ones who are being corrupt and running everything into the ground. They don't see a system of neo-colonialism, which wouldn't exist without white puppeteers, right?
Yeah.
People always see the puppet, but they never see the puppeteer. People blame the puppet, but they never blame the puppeteer. Yeah. That's what Malcolm X said, right?
And I noticed that even, this is one of my issues with our people on the continent is that I notice everyone's constantly pointing out the corrupt leadership, but you hardly hear them point the finger at the colonial power who's behind the corrupt leadership. I mean,
nobody knows about the CIA. Nobody knows about how Mugabe got ousted. You know what I mean?
Not even just that though, but for example, what with FAL, my organization, one of the things that we're dealing with is the struggle in Togo for liberation right now. And a lot of people who are Togolese, they understand that the regime is horrible. They've been doing these horrible things to the people and the regime has to go. But I don't hear a lot of people talking about the fact that the regime is being solely supported by the French government and the American government to an extent. But really, France is the one who keeps that regime in power. The military is trained by France. They're getting their equipment from France. So the fact that we have to have a dual role. We have to get these sellouts out of here. We have to get this corrupt leadership out of here. But we also have to have a serious, we have to be alert to the fact that this is all paid for. This is all planned. This is all done on purpose. And this is kind of related, but my other issue with us, Africans in America, is that we're quick to divide ourselves and say, well, we can't be Pan-Africanists, we can't be this, we can't be that, or Africans are this, or Africans are that. But we never want to acknowledge the fact that even our sentiment in that way, even the fact that we don't regard ourselves as African, that was planned. We were told that we were not African. We were told that we were Negro. We were told that we were niggers. We were told that we should disembody ourselves from our continent and not keep any of our culture. We have to understand we weren't even allowed to speak our own language. And even in other in other places where slavery happened, such as the Caribbean and Latin America, they at least got to speak their language. But us, we were told we could not speak our language. We could not consider ourselves African. That was a completely intentional.
Too. But yeah, I hear you.
Yeah, it was intentional. So when I hear people, regurgitate these stereotypes and act like them regurgitating these stereotypes is some type of educational movement. No, you're honestly feeding into the system that put us in this position to think that we're not African and to think that we're not part of a global thing that's going on and to segregate us from our homeland. So, you know, it's funny. It's not intellectual to me. If anything, you're being reactionary to what you've been taught and what you've learned from your oppressor.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, I agree. Like, I think a lot of the time when people, I think it's a lot easier for people to blame other Black people for symptoms of a particular issue than it is to blame the person who has power. You know what I mean?
Right.
So, I mean, oftentimes people will, I mean, nobody's gonna fire you for talking craziness or pathological or racist nonsense against Black people. No one's gonna get fired for that. You know what I mean? You will get fired for talking some wild stuff about your racist boss or your boss who decides to depict African people in a particular way. I mean, the reason I say boss is because I'm trying to bring it home that people work in institutions that are complicit within racism. Whatever the system is, you know, whether it's medical, whether it's media, whether it's something, all of these institutions have a role to play within a racist nation or within a nation of African self-determination. Now, I mean, you're not going to turn no white nation around, but all I'm saying, institution around, all I'm saying is, I agree with you in that people don't see the puppeteer. People don't see who's funding what. You know, my mother, she always raised me. When my mother said, she said, I live by the golden rule. You know, when I got in trouble in school, she used to tell me, she's like, I hold the gold, so I rule. You know, I bought you your clothes. I bought you the food you eat. You know, this house is mine, so that means your room is mine. It's the golden rule. I own you. She didn't say I own you, but she basically saying like you need me. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, you're my son, you need me. So that means don't talk back, don't talk nonsense. You golden rule.
Can I?
So I always use that when I looked at organizations, whether they're in Africa, whether they're in South America, whether they're here. You have to look where they're getting their funding, who has the power, who's leveraging them in order to advance particular interests. Now, you always see the organizations that advance, you know, apologetic or white interests. They're always being funded by somebody who's of the complexion of the protection for the collection. You know what I'm saying? Like, Wale, sorry.
You know, it's all good. I want to share one thing that I think is kind of pointed, and it kind of like ties in well to this whole notion of the hate for Pan Afrikanism is being fueled by a rejection of African identity. I'm going to share my screen just really quick.
I ain't gonna look.
1 second. I want to share my screen with you good folks. Can you see my screen? You see this article on my screen? Yes, no?
Yeah, a little bit.
Can y'all see the article on my screen at all?
Yeah.
All right, cool. This is an article that was written by W.E. Du Bois. It's actually a speech. It's called Whither Now and Why. I only want to read like basically like a paragraph and a half in here. But it was written when he was 92 years old in 1960, right? So it says here, there is much hard work to be done before the Negro becomes a voter, before he has equal rights to education, and before he can claim complete civil and social equality. Yet this situation is in sight, and it brings, not as many assume, an end to the so-called Negro problem, but a beginning of an even more difficult problem of race and culture. Because what we must now ask ourselves is, when we become equal American citizens, what will be our aims and ideals, and what will we have to do with selecting these aims and ideals? Are we to assume that we will simply adopt the ideals of Americans and become what they are or want to be, and that we will have in this process no ideals of our own? That would mean that we would cease to be Negroes as such and become white in action, if not completely in color. We would take on the culture of white Americans, doing as they do and thinking as they think. Manifestly, this would not be satisfactory. physically, it would mean that we would be integrated with Americans, losing, first of all, the physical evidence of color and hair and racial type. We would lose our memory of Negro history and of the racial peculiarities which have long been associated with the Negro. We would cease to acknowledge any greater tie with Africa than with England and or Germany. I'll stop there because I could keep. Let me stop sharing my video. Stop sharing my screen.
That's my name. That's my last name.
How do I stop sharing the screen? Stop sharing. The reason why I wanted to bring that up, because I recall I was watching this Yvette Carnell video where she was talking about like her blood mixture as a Black American descendant of slaves. She was like, well, we're always talking about Africa. What about our European ancestry? What about our German ancestry?
Everybody's not a mulatto. She's stupid.
No, I understand that, but I'm just talking about when you look at kind of like, you know, what Du Bois is hitting on here. He's saying essentially that this whole movement towards integration or assimilation represents a putting off of Blackness or putting off of Africanness in hopes of losing ourselves, you know, in the American mainstream. And if that is in fact our desire as African people, then it only makes sense that we get so much pushback when you are trying to, you know, you're trying to give people back what they're essentially putting down. You know what I mean? It's like, it's like, I don't know. It's hard to come up with like a real world example, but like, let's say like, you know, let's say you walked away from the table without paying your tip and you're trying to like hurry up and get away from the table, but somebody is calling you back to the table like, hey, you left something here. You know, I think that's kind of like how it is with like African like identity. Like people are like trying to get the hell away from the table and they're mad at these Pan Africans who are like, yo, like your identity is here. You need to come back and pick it up. Like, I mean, that's maybe a corny analogy. I'm just saying like the hate that Pan Afrikanism received, I know it's rooted in self-hate. It's of course rooted in economic anxiety.
Let me be a coon and
lack of that historical understanding. So I thought that was important to bring out. But with our last 15 minutes, African Esquire, our faithful leader, if you could just, you know, what are a few things that we could do essentially to see a reemergence or a revival of Pan Afrikanism amongst this current generation?
Before we get there, I just wanted to, so Kofi Shabazz, he asked an interesting question. He says, I think Pan Afrikanism has been infiltrated by people that don't have Black Americans' best interests. And I think that it's important to just talk about that briefly because I did notice a lot of the comments surrounding Yvette's video being that I've heard a lot of people say, you know, Africa needs to be fighting for African Americans and Africa, they don't like African Americans. They need to have our interests. I mean, briefly, do you all have thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, go ahead, bro. You got it.
Cool. I mean, I agree. I mean, people, Africans here in the United States, I don't like Black Americans, but Africans here in the United States should be equally a part of Pan Afrikanism as would any Pan African ethnic formation within the Western Hemisphere. I mean, we're no different. I mean, we live within one of the most powerful countries in the world, but that doesn't make us any less African than anybody who lives anywhere else under European domination. I mean, I think it's silly just to say that geography determines our who we are. But one of the things that I wanted to bring up, and you know, the conversation was so interesting and my Wi-Fi was so bad that I forgot. I wanted to bring up the idea of continentalist Pan Afrikanism versus Black Power Pan Afrikanism, where people only believe people who are on the continent should be Pan Africanist. But a lot of those people, they include Arabs, but they don't include people of the diaspora. Not Ali Missouri, he has a whole section for people who are in the diaspora, but at the same time, he includes Arabs within his understanding of Pan Africanism because they live on the continent. And he doesn't seem to care much about African or anti-Black racism from Arabs. He doesn't seem to care much. But either way, yeah, African Americans should be considered a part of it. And I don't, and one other thing, this is the last thing. I don't think we should talk about Pan Afrikanism as this abstraction that we are not a part of, as we're like, oh, Pan Afrikanism should fight for us. I think we should say, we are Pan Africanists, and this is who I see myself in solidarity with, or which policies I support. You know, I don't think we should have this abstract idea of Pan Africanism. I think we should see ourselves as, this is what I'm doing here, and this is who I'm coordinating with there. That's Pan Africanism. That's Black unity. And I don't think it should be an abstraction. I think we should have more clearly defined ideals about who we support and why. But I don't think it should be this abstract idea like Pan Africanism, you know, like this thing that isn't practical in front of us. It should be this thing that I'm actively a participant within, and my family is a part of it. My community that I deal with, the organization I deal with, is a part of it. The people that I go see, or the people that I talk to across the ocean, they're a part of it. The people that I go see across the ocean, or the people that I go see in the Caribbean, they're a part of it. You know, I don't think Pan Africanism should be limited to this, you know, idea that we're not a part of. You know what I mean?
So can I, in answering the question, I'll say this: I don't believe that Pan-African identity and colonial identity can exist simultaneously. I think that you either have to have one or the other. So the question, the role of Black Americans or African Americans within Pan-Africanism, I think that—
Sorry, the question was, let me just read it again. I think Pan-Africanism has been infiltrated by people that don't have Black Americans' best interests.
Yeah. So when I hear that question, you know, there's almost like a presupposition or an assumption that like Black Americans are not Africans, right? So for me, like when I'm thinking about Pan-Africanism, like I'm thinking about African people. I'm thinking about African people regardless of geography, behaving in the interest of African people collectively, right? So Africans in America, or Black Americans or whatever, we are just a subset of the global African population that shares a common a common reality right now. So I think that like all of our, you know, movements, behaviors, actions need to be in a direction that's focused on dismantling kind of like that reality. I think that when we tie our identity,
yes, my bad.
When we tie our identity to who enslaved us, like, you know, I gave a lecture recently called Nigerianism on Trial, and the lecture was essentially a critique of micronationalism, and it's the idea that we identify ourselves culturally or whatever based upon who enslaved our ancestors, right? So as Black Americans, we are the descendants of the people who were enslaved by the children of the British who rebelled against the crown and became the Americans, right? So we start our history here at 1619. We don't connect ourselves to the Africans who were brought by the French or by the Spanish to the Caribbean islands. We don't connect ourselves to the Africans who were brought by the British to the Caribbean islands. We connect with, like, our identity is solely tied not to each other, it's tied to our oppressor. And
it's
I think
not to what they did, not what we did.
Until that colonial identity is dismantled, I don't think you can truly have Pan-Africanism, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I would just want people to keep in mind that something interesting in Pan-Africanism, and this will kind of segue into the fourth question. We have to remember Pan-Africanism, the continent of Africa was really not where Pan-Africanism started as an ideology, because the continent of Africa, first of all, had not yet, they did not have the luxury or access to Garvey's writings, for example. There was the colonialists intentionally banned the UNNIA writings. And so there was an intentional effort to keep the idea of Pan-Africanism out of Africa. And it really got its bearing more so in the Caribbean and the United States and somewhat in Europe as well. So when we make these categorizations, well, why isn't Africa fighting for us? Or why isn't Africa doing this? First, we have to keep in mind, number one, that Africa is as colonialized as it was in the early part of the 1900s. It is still being controlled by puppet governments and still having
proxy.
What's that?
I said by proxy, but go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. Proxy governments, and it's still 100% colonized. Although you might see black faces, it's the same thing as how we might see a black face. You might see a black prison warden, or you might see a black mayor. You might see a black president, you know, and it might look like, oh, well, therefore the black is in control, therefore they're controlling the narrative. No, it's the same exact thing as we see in America, is that you'll have a black face as the representative of Ghana, the representative of Zimbabwe or whatever, and you think that they're in control of things, but they're not, because they're having to answer to someone else who's actually paying for the regime and actually making deals with the government behind the back of the people.
You know, I like to borrow a quote.
What's that?
I said I like to borrow a quote just to add to what you're saying. I like to borrow a quote from Dr. Obadale Kambone, where I mean, it's an African proverb. I'm not sure where he got it. I just remember hearing him say it, where he said, a man walks into a forest with an axe over his shoulder, and the trees look at the handle of the axe and say, "It's one of us."
Mm-hmm.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Where you look like us, and then okay, you're one of us, and then you know, I'm not gonna explain it because that will ruin my bar. But there you go.
No, but and that's what we have to realize, is that I think, you know, a lot of the mentalities that I've seen is saying, well, why doesn't Africa speak for us? First of all, or why don't they consider us one of them? When you talk to a lot of Africans who are actually from the continent, they do regard us as Africans. I mean, I've been to Africa.
Conscious ones.
What's that?
Conscious ones. You can't use the unconscious to define. But anything, I agree with you. I'm sorry.
When I was on the continent, they were actually upset with me that, and I'm, you know, trying to learn Tree, but they were upset that, you know, well, you know, you have your ancestry here in Ghana. Why didn't you learn the language? And so, you know, they made me promise that I would learn the language next time. So this mentality that we have that, we're seen as different. I mean, to them, when they see a black person, automatically is African. It's us that have been taught that there's this separation. So I don't know where I was going
on the continent who don't think that we African too, but they ignorant. Like, that's what I'm saying. We can't, like, I wasn't.
You can't take one or two people.
We can't take the opinions of the unconscious to define who we are, or or we can't define what is based on who's unconscious and who doesn't know what. We have to use the conscious to define things.
When we move into that to the last question, like, just to piggyback on what you just said, do you see how even the way that we frame the question separates us from Africa? And again, this is an unconscious question. This is someone who's asking the question. If someone says to you, you know, why isn't Africa fighting for us? Like, as a conscious person, what that person is essentially saying is, why in
a colonized nation fighting for people across the ocean?
Hold on, no. That's
dumb. Like, for them to ask that.
That's not the point I'm trying to make. When someone says, why isn't Africa fighting for us? That's like saying, why I'm not, like, fighting for myself. Because when you ask that question, you separate yourself from Africa. Like, separation is inherent in the question. It's us and Africa, as if we are something different than Africa. Like, I think that getting people to understand that, right, raising that awareness, and I think that delves into, like, the final question: how do we increase that type of understanding? Like what is it going to take for us to see a revival in Pan-African consciousness, a revival in the movement towards a Pan-African Renaissance? Like,
we got to go to the epicenter of Black people. We can't be looking for people who are $200,000 in debt with Sally Mae to make to make a lifestyle change towards Africa. I mean, some will, most won't. You know what I mean? We gotta give the knowledge to the people who need it. You know what I'm saying? Like the people who actually will benefit their lifestyle from ideas that they did not know. That's the only way it'll change, because people, you know, I think it's important when, you know, I don't want to be wrong. I think it was Elijah Muhammad where he was talking about you have to feed people before you give them ideas. So the thing is, if you're not feeding them, then they'll hear you. They'll be dialoguing with you. They'll have a conversation with you, and they'll hear you and be like, that's interesting. That's a good idea. You know, I agree with that. But then they won't change their lifestyle unless their life depends on it. You know what I mean? So we have to convince people that their life depends on it, or this doesn't contradict your lifestyle. You know, when we give them information, we have to be like, all right, you can live the life you live, and then you'll transform, and then you won't contradict your living style. You know what I mean? Or this will help your lifestyle. This will save your life. You know what I mean? We have to connect it to that. Anybody who's outside of that is outside of the grasp of ideas. I don't think we can reach those people.
So for me, when I was thinking about this question, I just came up with 3 points. One, in order for us to have
oh, you breaking up.
Wait, what happened?
You were breaking up.
Oh.
I got an echo.
My friend said I got something.
Am I good now?
Mute your situation. That might be you. Send them out. Can you mute?
Mute?
Yeah.
All right, how you mute? Here you go.
We get an echo.
Is that better?
I still got an echo with mine. I'll mute you.
You muted yourself.
Yeah, I unmuted.
I never heard an echo.
I think I'm okay. Oh, there's an echo.
Just unmute yourself, Omowale. So when I thought about this question, I thought of 3 points. One, we have to focus on disseminating information about Pan Afrikanism, about the ideology and why it's essential to us to have it in this time. A lot of people don't understand that where the United States and Europe are going economically. You know, you probably need to rethink whether or not you really want to integrate into this society, because what all economists are saying is that there's going to be another depression far worse than anything that we've seen. We know that they're essentially reaching their peak, and everything it's only a matter of time. So if you're thinking about, well, that's our ultimate goal, that's our ultimate, that's how we're going to be liberated, we're going to integrate into American society, then you might want to start doing research on what's going on economically around the world. So we need to regroup as a people and understand that our interests are not going to be inside of just staying here and trying to enjoy the spoils of Africa, but actually understand that our interests are inside of a liberated and free Africa, where Africa has control of its own resources and African people have the ability to actually go back to Africa, should you choose to go back to Africa, and actually take place in something that's rightfully ours. So that part of that is just getting the information out and helping people understand that the way things are going, that you might need to reconsider what your plans are as far as, or even if that doesn't happen in our lifetime, for our children or our children's children, we need to start regrouping and understanding that it is essential that we have a plan as far as how we're going to continue as a people. The other thing that I think that Africa has to control the narrative. I think that more and more there has to be Pan Africanists who are actually on the continent. And I noticed there are some, but when I see a lot of people who call themselves Pan Africanists who are actually on the continent, it seems like a watered down Pan Africanism. So it's Pan Africanism, but we're also going to have these dealings with people who don't mean any good for us. We're also going to continue with the same policies. We're going to continue allowing Europe to do certain things in our country. Is everything okay?
Yep.
Yeah, I was just gonna say.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just gonna say.
Okay. Wait, I got one more point after that. But go ahead.
What you
saying something about what I was just saying?
No, I said let her finish.
Okay. So I forget where I was at, but so we have to have Africa control the narrative, and we have to once again see Africans on the continent disseminating information about Pan Afrikanism, because a lot of times I do see that it is dominated by people outside of Africa. While that's completely fine, we're just as part of Africa as people on the continent. Our ultimate goal is liberation of Africa. So we can keep talking all we want, but if the resources and the economic situation is not controlled by us, then we're just having conversations. We're not actually doing something to take power inside of the continent that we're from. The last thing that I came up with is that we really have to be organized, and organized all over the diaspora, but also really need to be organized on a continent. We have to be, it just gets to me sometimes, you know, it's so odd to me how it's so normalized by our people that you'll have like, you'll be in a country, an African country, and you have a European power owning the mines, you'll have a Chinese power owning this diamond mine, like, and that's normal to you. You're normalized to the fact that your own people don't have access to the resources that are inside of your country. And a part of that is that we're not organized. We're not organized to take power. We're not organized to reassert ourselves and say, no, this is something that's rightfully ours, so we're going to take it back. So if we're not organized, that's the other thing that will stop Pan Afrikanism from revitalizing.
All right. That was all right. All right. I got an echo.
You're good. You're good on my end.
Okay. Could you mute your microphone? I want to see myself. All right.
I'm muted, so
cool. So Zach, mute. All right. So I don't have the echo while you guys are muted. So let me I want to get this off. First of all, what our sister African Esquire just said was 100%, 1,000%, 1,000,000% on point. Like, so you actually could have closed this out on that, but I want to try to kind of like just ad lib and highlight just some additional points. So for me, or for us, what I think is required to see a revitalization or a revival in Pan-African consciousness or Pan-African movement towards a global African Renaissance, there's several things. First, I think that we have to acknowledge that Pan-Afrikanism is a collective consciousness that functions at the grassroots level. And the only way to adequately and methodically operate at the grassroots level is through the vehicle of organization. So we don't get a reemergence of Pan-Afrikanism without a reemergence of Pan-African organizations. Like you mentioned, like the UNIA. The UNIA was a global organization. The organization that I'm currently a part of, Afrocentricity International, we are a global organization, and our goal is to build a global network that functions at the grassroots level with a core belief that consciousness precedes unity, right? So our motto it's really simple. We believe that if you change the consciousness of people, you can change the behavior of people, and if you change the behavior of people, you can change the conditions of people, right? So in order for Pan-Afrikanism to kind of like to rebound, like there needs to be work at the grassroots level that is raising the consciousness of our people. The second point that I have here is when we say back to Africa, because I agree with you 100%, like there is no Pan-African future, there is no Pan-African unity without a redemption of Africa. So we need to see a growing movement of true Pan-Africanism occurring on the continent. But when we say back to Africa, people on the continent also need to go back to Africa, right? Because it's not necessarily 100% a physical statement. We have to get back to Africa mentally, spiritually. Like there needs to be a divorce or a separation.
And behaviorally.
There needs to be a divorce and a separation from this current paradigm that upholds the current system that oppresses us globally. As long as we continue to participate give of our energy, give of our material resources, give over our children, our progeny, to this system will continue to exist. So you need a separatist, a maroon, a nationalist, a African nationalist consciousness that recognize that separation is key. And the last point that I wanted to speak here again is just reiterating my first point, is the need for organizations. Like, this does not happen with us operating as individuals. Our sister African Esquire, the leader that she is, she founded an organization, which, before we get off the line tonight, the new viewers who are just seeing her channel for the first time, she should definitely give a quick spill about her organization. But the need for us to have a vanguard of Pan-African organizations that are about doing the work of increasing the consciousness of our people, teaching them what Pan-Africanism is all about, and making sure that we are operating in a manner that will bring about a Pan-African reality. That's really it on my end.
All right, so I don't know if I'm closing out or not, but one of the things that I would like to say is, I appreciate everybody, and then, but at the same time, when this is over, I have a Google Doc. I have a link that I'll share where I have different, a few books, and then like a bunch of articles that I think are related to not just Pan-Africanism itself, but also Pan-Africanism. So I think I'll share that on Twitter. I'll share that on Twitter. Anybody I spoke to personally. Anybody who's watching this personally, you can follow me at Son of Malcolm _ between the words at Temple. At Twitter, on Twitter, and I'll shoot it to you through a DM. And because I don't want this conversation to necessarily end here with us. I want people to take it back to your family, take it back to your friends, take it back to other people, take it back to your organizations if you're part of one. And if you're not part of one, I encourage you to join one. And I think Pan-Africanism is more so. I think it's simple, and I think it's efficient, and I think it's effective to just say Pan-Africanism is Black unity. Pan-Africanism is Black unity. Black nationalism at its core is Pan-Africanism. Any Black resistance movement across the board, no matter where it was, had Africans who were not from where the movement was happening, but they were coordinating. That's Pan-Africanism. So I think people should know that Pan-Africanism exists with white hegemonic rule, and it exists without it. So we need to get in the idea of we're being self-determining. We're doing what we need to do on our own accord. We're being African on our own accord, more so than we're just reacting. Mind you, we get it twisted. We need to do what we need to do to get out of this condition. But we need to start doing what we would do.
Okay, Son of Malcolm.
We didn't have that.
Son of Malcolm, your connection's breaking up again. I'm gonna give some closing thoughts to. Okay. Thanks for everyone for sticking through us. We're just having some technical difficulties. But just some closing thoughts from me. I read someone said in the comment section that
bang on everybody and close out.
Let me see. Okay. So I read in the comment section, someone said that part of the problem with Pan-Africanism is whenever we start making statements, they say to read books, and that's kind of dismissive, but it's really not dismissive, because I want to reiterate again that this is a process of knowledge, it's a process of discovering truth, and it's a process of reading history and coming to your own conclusions. And so you don't necessarily have to be a Pan-Africanist, but at all means, do research on the things that we're saying. See if what we're saying is true. Look up what's going on inside of the world economy and come to your own intelligent decision. So that's really what we wanted to do this for. There's a lot of negative narratives going out. And so now you get to see the narrative from 3 people who actually do consider themselves Pan-Africanists. So you can compare what we have been saying and come to your own conclusion. So I guess just to close out, Omowale said I should talk about my organization. I'll just say briefly, it's Federation of African Liberation. It's really an organization that was based off of the Organization of Afro-American Unity, and we modernized it and tried to create something that's Pan-Africanist. And the link to that is in the description. And Omowale, do you also want to talk about your organization briefly?
Yeah, the organization that I'm a part of is Eurocentric International. It's an organization that was modeled after Marcus Garvey's UNIA. We were founded back in 2011. We currently have chapters on every continent. We are growing pretty rapidly abroad. Our slowest growth is right now in the US, but we do have a chapter in the Philadelphia area. So if you're in Philly, we meet every first and third Sunday of the month at 2:30 p.m. at the Malefi Kete Asante Institute, 5535 Germantown Avenue. Aside from that, you can connect with me on Twitter at Omowale Africa. I appreciate all the viewers that kind of like tuned in tonight. I appreciate all your questions. And more than anything, I appreciate and love our sister, African Esquire. You know, her command of the conversation, her command of the content. It's very important. So if you're going to be about this work, you have to be serious about doing this work, because our people, the conditions of our people are serious. So I always respect and I give hats off whenever I see somebody who is truly, truly not just talking about it, but, you know, being about it. So that's really all I got to say. And that's it.
All right, I'm going to close out the conversation. Everyone, I hope you have a good night.